Hey guys, so I've gotten a few questions lately about big bore kits versus gear reductions. So now that the 520 Rubicon is a thing, the parts are pretty readily available, and a bunch of people are saying, should I upgrade my Rancher or my 500 Rubicon to a 520 to turn bigger tires instead of doing a gear reduction? And the answer that I've been telling everyone when I rebuild their motors, stuff like that, is gear reductions are a much more bang for your buck than a big bore kit. So if you can achieve what you want to achieve as far as turning your tires with a gear reduction, that's what you should always do. Um, there's way fewer downsides to a gear reduction than there are to a big bore kit, and it's also a much bigger difference in torque to the wheels. Now, recently, someone on Facebook was claiming that his big bore kits make just as big of a difference as running a 40 or 60% gear reduction. And I called him out and said that's bullshit because it's 100% bullshit. So this video is going to try to um, put some information out there about the differences between a big bore kit and a gear reduction. I'm going to try to do it in very simple terms without using any thermodynamics because when I start doing that, people stop listening to me. And we're going to try to use some comparisons and some rules of thumb to just real simply explain the torque gains you get from a gear reduction and then the torque gains you get from a big bore kit. A gear reduction is extremely simple. So this is a 40% gear reduction. If you count the teeth, it's the ratio. So if you count the big gear teeth, you divide by the little gear teeth, that gives you the gear ratio of this gear set. If you take that and you compare it to your stock ratio, your stock gear set, the ratio comes out to about 1.4. So you get 1.4 times more torque by dropping these gears into your motor. Um, it's really that simple. 1.4, 40% increase. That's all there is to it. This gives you a mechanical advantage. So at every point throughout your RPM curve, you're going to putting down about 40 more or 40% more torque to the wheels. There's nothing here that can wear out. It doesn't really increase. You do turn more RPMs for the same speed, but it doesn't really increase any of the wear on your engine that an aftermarket big bore is going to do. There's no extra heating. It's just drop in, never think about it again. There's no maintenance to do it. It's 100% the way to go. Now, if you've put in a big gear reduction in your bike and you still need more power and you don't mind throwing a ton of money into your machine, yeah, then go do a big bore kit. But the first step should always be to get the proper gearing. And people are going to say, well, what if I don't want to lose top speed? That's the one thing you're giving away with a gear reduction, right? It's a mechanical advantage. You're trading top speed for torque. However, if you're running 40% bigger tires, which a lot of us are, you end up actually being stock geared when you do a gear reduction. It's the same thing with trucks, right? Like I'm building a GX 460. I went up, 20% in tires. I'm going to gear it down 20% to match the factory ratio at speed. That's just how you set things up properly. So saying that no, you shouldn't do a gear reduction to turn big tires, you should just do a big bore kit. That's the only people that are going to tell you that are people who are selling big bore kits. That's terrible advice. And of course, everyone who buys the big bore kit is going to tell you it's awesome because they want to feel like they made a good idea and had a good purchase when they purchased it. So they're also biased. So you shouldn't listen to them either. What you should really do is do some research and a little bit of math, and you'll see that big bore kits don't make any sense unless you've already exhausted all the other options. Okay, so we all understand how gear reductions work. It's very simple. Let's start looking through a couple things. So this is a fundamental you just have to understand for this discussion. Power, horsepower, is torque times RPM times a constant. So they are related. And you can see that every dyno graph is going to cross the torque and our horsepower curves will cross at like 5,200 RPMs roughly. This graph shows it right at 5,000, but that's because they are here. Yeah, here it is. 5,252 if you're doing foot-pounds to horsepower. So torque and horsepower are related. Um, that's how I just want to throw that out there. That's a very simple equation that everyone should understand. For the purposes of this video, we're talking about torque, specifically low-end torque that you need to get tires turning in thick mud. Okay. One rule of thumb we're going to be using here is that if you multiply your cubic inches times 1.25, that's a good estimate for how much torque your motor is going to make. Now, this applies to modern or more modern engines with matched flow for the extra displacement, so you keep your volumetric efficiencies up. Basically, this is a best case type thing when comparing to a Honda 300. You can beat this with some modern motors, but a Honda 300 is very outdated, and so is a Rubicon 500 for that matter. It's got liquid cooling, but it's still two valve per cylinder, small intake, small exhaust, etc. But we're going to use that as a rule of thumb and just know that that's like the best case scenario for a two valve Honda motor. Another rule of thumb that's good to have is how much does compression ratio make a difference? So a good rule of thumb is that for every full point of compression ratio, aka 10 to 11, you increase your power by about 3%. And as we talked about back here, power and torque are related by RPM times a constant. So for the purposes of this discussion, we're going to say every point of compression ratio gives you 3% more torque as well. These are all approximations. I'm just trying to keep it simple. Okay, what else was I going to show you? There's a couple things here we'll come back to. So let me flip over to my Excel chart. Um, so if we use those two approximations I just went over, that cubic inches times 1.25 gives you your torque. You can see that a Honda 300 is 282 cc's. You multiply that by a constant to get it into cubic inches, so that's 17.2 cubic inches. You multiply that times 1.25, you get 21.5 pound-feet of torque. That's actually probably a little high for a Honda 300. It's probably around like, I don't know, 14, because it's such a low efficiency, old school two-valve motor. Um, but let's be generous and let's say big bore kits are great and let's see what's the best they could do, right? So then if you went to a 327 cc big bore kit, that's 20 cubic inches times 1.25 is 25. So doing a big bore kit just with the same compression ratio would get you about 16% more torque using this rule of thumb. This is just to get us into the ballpark. I know this is not perfect. Everyone's going to freak out in the comment section below. I'm just trying to get people to understand, rough magnitudes. So 16% increase of torque from the extra displacement from the bigger piston. Okay, we're not even going to go into why. We're just going to use rules of thumb to keep it simple. And then if you look at the compression ratio, say you went from a 9 to 1, which is stock, to 11 to 1. 11 to 1 is generally known among people who, you know, are into old school motors. That 11 to 1 is about as high as you want to go on an air-cooled motor, especially in the South. Otherwise, you get into issues where you have to run really rich or you're going to get detonation stuff because you're running such high compression. You can't regulate your temperatures very well because you're relying on ambient air flowing over fins. So 11 to 1 is as high as I ever go when I'm building an air-cooled motor. So we use 11 to 1 here. So that's 2 full points increase of compression, 3% per point. That gives you another 6%. Now you'd think you would just add these two numbers together. You really have to kind of multiply them, but it doesn't make that big of a difference in this case. So your total ideal increase in torque is about 23%. Now, I say ideal again because this is just throwing on a big bore kit onto a 300, which was the claim. All you have to do is put this big bore kit on there and it's as good as a gear reduction. Um, you're not going to have the same volumetric efficiencies when you put that bigger piston because the rest of the engine wasn't designed for it, right? Your valves are too small, carburetor's too small, exhaust is too small. But this number right here kind of assumes that you've matched all that. You've matched the flow to keep your volumetric efficiency up. So this is, in the best case, that big bore kit is going to give you around 23% increase in torque. Okay, that's about half what a gear reduction would give you, or a third if you did a 60%. So to say that your big bore kit is magical and is as good as a gear reduction at turning tires is objectively bullshit. Let's look at it another way. So if you go online, you can find a lot of dyno charts, right? You can't really find much for Honda 300s or Honda 4-wheelers for that matter, but there's a lot of stuff for Harleys. So here's a good dyno chart about a company that sells a big bore kit. And their big bore kit gave them a 17.8% gain in torque. And it's pretty low down torque, right? This is the area we're looking at. That's why I picked this diagram because I wanted to find something with a good torque gain down low. A big Harley V-twin tends to do that. Now, this big bore kit, what was I going to show you? Yeah, here's the big picture of it. So this is like a similar percent increase in displacement. That's why I picked it, and it had a good torque gain down low. So say 20%. So that's in the ballpark of what we were talking about using the rules of thumb. So that's a good sanity check there. If we look at this sheet, I went through and kind of did a comparison. So if you take that Milwaukee 8 Harley Davidson motor, its stock cubic inches is 107 with a compression ratio of 10. The big bore kit gets you up to 124, compression ratio of 10.4. So by increasing the displacement by about 16%, you got about 18% more torque. Also a little bump in compression ratio, right? So if we apply that that logic to the Honda 300, this kit right here also increases by about 16% displacement. You would expect around 18% increase in torque. 18% increase in torque on a Honda 300 is not enough to turn a 28-inch tire properly, not even a 30-inch tire, right? Everyone since the beginning of time and the beginning of gear reductions has run a 53% gear reduction in a 300 to properly run 30s. This is really far from 53%, right? It's not even half. So both of these numbers kind of show you this is probably a more real world application because it's actually a dyno measurement from a big bore kit. However, I'd say this is best case again as well because this Harley is a four valve head, which means that it can flow more air to keep the efficiency up with the big bore kit. The 300 is not going to have as great an improvement because it's a two valve head. So that's just something to point out. So there's two examples of ways that you can very simply compare the effect of a big bore kit. And it's very clear that it's not going to be enough to turn big tires. Now, I'm not saying it doesn't make a difference. 20% increase in torque on both of these is significant, but it's not enough for a 300. A 300 needs a lot of help to turn big tires. So yeah, just trying to explain that. Hopefully you guys find that useful. Another kind of interesting thing I came across when I was looking into this is Can-Am recently came out with a new four-wheeler. I did a video on it, and they published the torque figures, which is kind of rare. Usually manufacturers don't publish anything. If they do, it's just horsepower. So we're talking about peak torque here. But this is the new Can-Am 700 single cylinder. Yes, it's a four valve head. Yes, it's liquid cooled. Yes, it's higher compression than a 300. But you can see, it's in the ballpark of 40 foot-pounds of torque. And that kind of jives because it's, twice the displacement of a 300. Yeah, it's going to be more efficient or whatever, but the point is you can't beat a gear reduction. Gears are key. Even with a belt drive, as long as it's got low gears after the belt drive or portals, you can turn big tires. You can put the high compression piston, the big piston in there, and it'll make a little bit of a difference, but it's nowhere near the bang for your buck of doing a gear reduction. So if you're going to do a build to turn big tires on a four-wheeler, you should always do the correct gear reduction for your tire size and then start making power. Because a lot of times the gear reduction is all you need and it doesn't wear out. So that's my final point to make is that big bore kits are high maintenance. So the Honda 300 engine was not made to cool a big piston. A big piston has more surface area, it's generating more heat from friction, right? The rings have more surface area they're scraping against, and the cooling on the Honda 300 isn't enough for it. So I used to do a bunch of big bore kits on 300s, and I would eat through rings all the time because the engine's running way hotter than it should be, especially down in the south. So big bore kits are high maintenance just for that reason alone, because you don't have adequate cooling on an air-cooled motor. On a liquid-cooled motor, there's usually extra cooling capacity. You can throw a 520 jug on a 420, it's going to have plenty of cooling capacity. That's not a problem. But on an air-cooled motor, it's something to think about. A gear reduction doesn't have any of those complications. And then finally, if you're thinking, oh, my bike's going to be too slow once I put a gear reduction in it, it's a Honda. It's slow anyways. Unless you're running on pavement, you don't have the suspension to go fast in any kind of off-roading. So yeah, if you go riding on pavement a lot, the loss in speed from gear reduction can be a big factor, but most people don't drive ATVs on pavement. So realistically, the concern isn't losing top speed. It's just that the Honda was slow to start out with. Okay, so that's my rant over. Hopefully that is helpful to everyone that keeps asking me these questions. And that's why I generally don't install big bore kits when I rebuild motors. I put a factory piston in it, and if you want more torque, I'll throw a bigger gear reduction. It's just more reliable and it makes more sense.